Maria pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen window, her dark hands clutching the edge of the marble countertop. The September rain drummed steadily against the mansion's windows, creating rivers that distorted her view of the garden below. She should have been preparing Mr. Hartwell's dinner. The salmon needed to be seasoned, the vegetables chopped, but something had pulled her to this window, some instinct she couldn't name. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, in the pouring rain, was Jonathan Hartwell himself. Not the cold, distant billionaire who barely acknowledged her presence when he passed through the halls. Not the hollow-eyed man who worked 20-hour days in his study, as if exhausting himself could somehow fill the emptiness. This was someone else entirely. He was dancing. In his arms, squealing with delight, was Maria's daughter. 2-year-old Sophie, her black curls plastered to her head, her yellow raincoat bright against the gray sky. Mr. Hartwell had lifted her high, spinning in circles while rain soaked through his expensive dress shirt. Sophie's laughter rang out so clearly that Maria could hear it even through the closed window, pure, uninhibited joy that seemed to light up the dreary afternoon. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. She had left Sophie in the playroom barely 20 minutes ago, distracted by her coloring books while Maria finished the morning's cleaning. The child must have wandered out through the garden door, drawn by the rain like children always were, finding magic in puddles and storms. She should run out there. She should apologize profusely, drag Sophie inside, promise it would never happen again. Mr. Hartwell could fire her on the spot, and he would have every right to. She was a single mother, completely dependent on this job. The salary was generous, far more than she could make anywhere else, and it came with a small cottage at the edge of the property where she and Sophie lived. Losing this position would mean losing everything. But Maria couldn't move. She stood frozen, watching something she had never expected to see. Mr. Hartwell set Sophie down gently in a puddle. The little girl immediately began jumping, splashing water everywhere, and instead of scolding her or walking away, the billionaire jumped too. His Italian leather shoes were ruined, his tailored pants soaked to the knees, but he didn't seem to care. He was smiling, actually smiling, in a way Maria had never witnessed in the 18 months she'd worked here. The mansion behind her felt impossibly silent, as if it were holding its breath along with her. This house had been a mausoleum for so long. After Mrs. Hartwell's death 3 years ago, dying in childbirth along with their baby daughter, Jonathan Hartwell had retreated so far into himself that the staff whispered he was more ghost than man. He spoke only when necessary, ate meals mechanically at his desk, and moved through the vast rooms like a shadow passing through someone else's life. Maria knew grief. She had lost Sophie's father before her daughter was even born, lost her own mother shortly after. She recognized the specific weight of sorrow that Mr. Hartwell carried, the way it curved his shoulders and dulled his eyes. But she had Sophie, and Sophie had forced her to keep living, keep laughing, keep finding reasons to wake up each morning. Mr. Hartwell had had nothing. Until now, apparently. Until a 2-year-old in a yellow raincoat had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. Sophie was showing him something now, probably a worm or an interesting rock, the kinds of treasures that captivated toddlers. Mr. Hartwell crouched down to her level, genuinely interested, listening with the same intense focus he usually reserved for board meetings and financial reports. Sophie chattered away, her tiny hands gesturing animatedly, and he nodded as if she were sharing the secrets of the universe. Maria felt tears prickling at her eyes. She didn't understand what she was witnessing, but she knew it mattered. Something had shifted in the rain-soaked garden, something fragile and precious that could shatter if she made the wrong move. The kitchen door suddenly swung open, making Maria jump. Helen, the head housekeeper, bustled in with an armful of fresh linens. "Maria, dear, have you seen?" Helen stopped mid-sentence, following Maria's gaze out the window. Her expression transformed from businesslike efficiency to stunned disbelief. "Is that?" "Yes," Maria whispered. "With your Sophie?" "Yes." They stood together in silence, watching. Helen had worked for the Hartwells for over 15 years. She had been there when Jonathan brought home his bride, when they announced the pregnancy, when Elizabeth Hartwell had hemorrhaged during an emergency C-section and died before anyone could save her or the baby. Helen had found Mr. Hartwell the next morning, still in his blood-stained clothes, sitting motionless in the nursery they'd prepared. "I've never seen him smile," Helen murmured. "Not once in 3 years. Not even a little." Maria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "You should probably get her," Helen added gently, "before he remembers who he is." But before Maria could move, Mr. Hartwell scooped Sophie up again, this time settling her on his shoulders. He began walking through the garden with long, purposeful strides while Sophie shrieked with delight, grabbing onto his hair for balance. They looked, for all the world, like a father and daughter playing in the rain on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Except nothing about this was ordinary. And Maria suddenly understood that everything was about to change. Jonathan Hartwell had not intended to step outside. He had not intended to do anything except sign the merger documents waiting on his desk, return 3 urgent calls from Tokyo, and review the quarterly projections his CFO had emailed at dawn. His life had become a series of tasks to complete, problems to solve, decisions to make, an endless stream of obligations that kept his mind occupied and his heart safely numb. But then he had heard laughter. He had been passing through the conservatory, taking a shortcut from his study to the home office, when the sound had stopped him cold. Pure, delighted laughter. A child's laughter. For a moment, his heart had seized with a pain so acute he'd had to grip the doorframe for support. For a moment, he had heard Elizabeth's laughter too, the way she used to laugh when they talked about their baby, about the life they were going to build. That baby would have been almost 3 years old now. A toddler. Like the child, he could see through the rain-streaked glass of the conservatory door. The little girl was jumping in puddles, her yellow raincoat bright against the gray afternoon. She was alone, completely absorbed in her play, finding joy in something as simple as rain and mud. When had Jonathan last found joy in anything? When had he last felt anything at all? Before he'd made a conscious decision, he was outside. The rain hit him immediately, cold and shocking, soaking through his shirt. The little girl looked up, her dark eyes going wide. She should have been frightened, a strange man approaching in the rain, but instead, she smiled at him with the uncomplicated trust that only very young children possess. "Hi," she announced, as if greeting him at a garden party rather than in the middle of a downpour. "Hello," Jonathan heard himself say. His voice sounded rusty and used to anything beyond terse business communications. "Rain," she declared, pointing at the sky in case he hadn't noticed. "Yes, quite a lot of it." She studied him with that intense way children have of looking at adults, as if they can see straight through all the layers of pretense. "You wet?" "I am. So are you." This observation seemed to delight her. She giggled and jumped in another puddle, splashing his already ruined shoes. Jonathan waited for irritation to surface. These shoes had cost more than most people earned in a month, but all he felt was a strange, unfamiliar lightness. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie." She pronounced it with great pride, as if her name were the most important thing in the world. "I too. 2 years old." "That's very grown up." Sophie nodded seriously, then held up her arms in the universal gesture of young children everywhere. "Pick me up." Jonathan hesitated. He had never held a child before. He and Elizabeth had taken parenting classes, read all the books, prepared themselves meticulously. But their daughter had died before Jonathan could ever touch her, and in the 3 years since, he had avoided children entirely, unable to bear the reminder of what he had lost. But Sophie was looking at him with such expectation, such certainty that he would not refuse her, that he found himself bending down and lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, warm despite the rain, and she smelled like baby shampoo and something indefinably sweet. She settled against him with complete confidence, as if she had known him her whole life. And then she giggled again, that same pure laughter that had drawn him outside in the first place. "Spin," she commanded, and without thinking, Jonathan spun. The world blurred around them, the gray sky, the green garden, the massive mansion that had become his prison. Sophie squealed with joy, and Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for so long he had forgotten it existed. When had he last played? When had he last done something for no reason except that it brought delight? Before Elizabeth's death, certainly. Before the pregnancy complications that had begun to worry them both. Before the fear that had crept into their happiness. He had been working too much even then, trying to build an empire to provide for his family, missing the fact that what they needed most was simply him. He set Sophie down, and she immediately began jumping in puddles again. This time, Jonathan jumped too. His $700 shoes made a satisfying splash, and Sophie's laughter doubled. He jumped again, harder, sending water flying, and realized he was smiling. Actually smiling, using muscles in his face that had atrophied from disuse. Sophie found a worm in the mud and proudly showed it to him. Jonathan, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, crouched down to admire the worm with the same serious attention he would give a business proposition. Sophie's running commentary was nearly incomprehensible. 2-year-olds were not known for their clarity, but he found himself nodding along as if every word made perfect sense. "Worm sleeping," Sophie informed him solemnly. "Is he?" "Yes. Sure." She pressed a finger to her lips. They both stared at the worm in respectful silence for a moment. Then Sophie carefully placed it in the mud. "Night-night, worm." The worm's prospects for survival seemed questionable, but Jonathan didn't mention this. Instead, he said, "That was very kind of you." Sophie beamed at him, and Jonathan felt that crack in his chest widen further. This child, this stranger's child, was breaking through defenses he had thought impenetrable. He should go back inside. He should return to his documents and his calls and the carefully controlled numbness that had become his life. But when Sophie held up her arms again, he lifted her onto his shoulders without hesitation. She grabbed his hair for balance, laughing as he stood to his full height. "Big," she announced, delighted by her new vantage point. Jonathan began walking through the garden, and Sophie provided commentary on everything she saw. Flower, bird, tree, more tree. Her enthusiasm was infectious, transforming his familiar garden into something magical. He had not felt this alive in 3 years. The realization should have terrified him. Feeling meant hurting, and he had built his entire existence around not hurting anymore. But Sophie's weight on his shoulders, her small hands in his hair, her delighted babble in his ear, none of it hurt. Instead, it felt like taking a breath after being underwater too long. He wondered whose child she was. One of the staff members? He employed a dozen people to maintain the house and grounds, but he had made a point of not knowing them personally. Knowing people meant caring about them, and caring about anyone meant vulnerability he couldn't afford. But clearly, he had failed at maintaining that distance. Because he was soaked to the skin, his clothes ruined, his schedule completely abandoned, and all he wanted was to keep walking through the rain, with this laughing child on his shoulders. "Where's your mother, Sophie?" he asked gently. Sophie pointed toward the house. "Mama work." So, her mother did work here. Jonathan felt a twinge of concern. Would the woman be angry that her daughter had wandered outside? Worried? He should take Sophie back inside, find her mother, apologize for what? For playing in the rain with a child who had somehow made him remember what joy felt like. As if summoned by his thoughts, the kitchen door opened. A woman stepped out, and Jonathan recognized her immediately. Maria, one of the housekeepers. She had worked for him for well over a year, always efficient, always quiet. He could count on one hand the number of times they had spoken directly. She looked terrified. Maria approached them slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The rain immediately soaked her uniform, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on Sophie, then on Jonathan, then back to Sophie, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm so sorry." "Sophie." She must have. I didn't realize she had gone outside. "I'm so sorry." Jonathan gently lifted Sophie from his shoulders and set her down. The little girl immediately ran to her mother, hugging her legs. Mama, we jumped in puddles and found a worm, and I was really big. Maria's hand stroked her daughter's wet hair, but her eyes remained on Jonathan, waiting for his reaction. He could see her trying to read his expression, trying to gauge whether she was about to lose her job. The realization struck him like a physical blow. She was afraid of him. This woman who had worked in his home for 18 months, who had cleaned his rooms and prepared his meals and asked for nothing, was standing in the rain afraid that he would punish her because her child had played in his garden. When had he become that person? Cold, unapproachable, someone to fear rather than trust. There's nothing to apologize for, Jonathan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Sophie was just showing me how to properly enjoy a rainy day. I'm afraid I've forgotten. Maria blinked, clearly not expecting that response. She shouldn't have bothered you, sir. She didn't bother me. The words felt inadequate for what he was trying to express. Sophie hadn't bothered him. She had saved him, though from what? He wasn't entirely sure. She's a delightful child. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Maria was already tugging gently on Sophie's hand. Say goodbye to Mr. Hartwell, sweetie. We need to get you dry and warm. But I'm not done playing, Sophie protested. We can play inside. Come on now. But my friend, Sophie pointed at Jonathan with the matter-of-fact certainty of a toddler who had decided they were now best friends. Maria's expression flickered with something between embarrassment and pain. Mr. Hartwell is very busy, Sophie. He has important work to do. Did he? Jonathan looked back at the mansion, at the windows of his study where documents waited, and his phone was probably ringing. Yes, he had work to do. He always had work to do. Work had become his armor against feeling anything, against remembering, against living. Actually, he heard himself say, I was thinking about having some hot chocolate. Would you two like to join me? The words hung in the rain-filled air between them. Maria stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Even Sophie went quiet, sensing the strange significance of the moment. Mr. Hartwell, we couldn't possibly, Maria began. Please, Jonathan interrupted. The word came out more desperately than he intended. I would appreciate the company. It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to anyone in 3 years. He would appreciate the company. He would appreciate not returning immediately to the hollow silence of his study. He would appreciate a little more time in the presence of this child who had somehow reminded him what it felt like to be human. Maria hesitated, clearly torn between refusing out of propriety and the uncertainty of how to refuse her employer. Finally, she nodded slowly. If you're certain, sir. I'm certain. But please, we're all soaking wet. Let's get inside before we catch pneumonia. They walked back to the house together, an unlikely trio. The billionaire in his ruined designer clothes, the housekeeper in her sodden uniform, and the 2-year-old in her yellow raincoat, chattering happily about worms and puddles. Helen met them at the door with towels. She must have been watching, and the look she gave Jonathan was so full of shock and hope that he had to look away. I'll have hot chocolate prepared in the conservatory, Helen said quickly. And perhaps some cookies? That would be perfect, Helen. Thank you. While Maria took Sophie to change into dry clothes from the bag she apparently kept at the house for emergencies, Jonathan went to his room and changed into casual clothes, jeans and a sweater he couldn't remember the last time he'd worn. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. His hair was still damp and disheveled. His cheeks had color in them for the first time in years. His eyes looked alive. He looked like someone who had just played in the rain with a child. He looked like someone who might, possibly, still remember how to be happy. The realization terrified him. By the time he reached the conservatory, Maria and Sophie were already there. Sophie had changed into pink leggings and a sweatshirt with a cat on it. Her hair was still damp but had been pulled into 2 small puffs on either side of her head. She was sitting at the small table Helen had set up, swinging her legs and humming to herself. Maria stood nearby, still in her damp uniform, looking profoundly uncomfortable. She started to speak as soon as Jonathan entered. Mr. Hartwell, I want to apologize again for Maria. He held up his hand gently. There's nothing to apologize for. Please sit down. She sat, but perched on the edge of her chair as if ready to flee at any moment. Sophie, in contrast, was completely at ease, examining the plate of cookies with serious consideration. Helen arrived with a tray bearing 3 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and a plate of sugar cookies, still warm from the oven. She set everything down with unusual ceremony, gave Jonathan another one of those hopeful looks, and quietly left. "Cookie," Sophie announced, reaching for one. "What do you say?" Maria prompted gently. "Please." Jonathan handed her a cookie, then slid a mug of hot chocolate toward Maria. She wrapped her hands around it but didn't drink, watching him warily. He realized she was waiting for him to speak, to explain this bizarre situation, to reveal what he wanted from her. What did he want? He wasn't entirely sure himself. He just knew he didn't want to be alone right now. He didn't want to return to the silence, and the work and the careful numbness. "How long have you worked here, Maria?" he asked. She looked surprised by the question. 18 months, sir." "And Sophie, you bring her to work with you?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Chun allows it." Mrs. Chun was the house manager, the person who actually handled the staff since Jonathan couldn't be bothered with such details. "We live in the cottage on the property. Sophie stays in the playroom when I'm working. I'm very careful to keep her out of your way. Today was an exception." "I'm not angry," Jonathan said firmly. "I'm asking because I'm realizing I know almost nothing about the people who work in my home. That's my failure, not yours." Maria didn't seem to know how to respond to that. She took a small sip of her hot chocolate, her eyes downcast. Sophie, meanwhile, had finished her cookie and was eyeing the mug in front of her. "That for me?" "Yes, sweetheart, but it's hot. Let Mama help you." Maria carefully lifted the mug to Sophie's lips, letting her take a small sip. Sophie's eyes went wide with delight. "Yummy." Jonathan found himself smiling again. "I'm glad you approve." "You have some?" Sophie asked him seriously. "I do." He took a sip of his own hot chocolate, which was excellent, as everything Helen made always was. They sat in oddly comfortable silence for a few moments. Rain continued to drum against the conservatory windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. "Tell me about yourself, Maria," Jonathan said finally. "I don't even know where you're from." Maria looked up startled. In 18 months of working for him, he had never asked her a personal question. Their interactions had been limited to brief nods in hallways, occasional instructions delivered through Mrs. Chun, and the kind of polite invisibility that existed between employers and household staff. "I'm from Honduras originally," she said carefully. "I came to the United States when I was 17. My mother was sick and the medical care here was better. She lived 5 more years. A shadow crossed her face. She passed 2 months after Sophie was born. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, and meant it. He understood loss. He lived with it every day. "Thank you, sir." Maria glanced at Sophie, who was now attempting to build a tower out of sugar cookies. Sophie never got to meet her grandmother, but I tell her stories. I want her to know where she comes from. "And Sophie's father?" The question was perhaps too personal, but Maria answered anyway. "He died before she was born. Car accident. We weren't married yet, but we were planning." She trailed off, then shook her head slightly, as if dismissing old pain. "It's been just the 2 of us since the beginning. Just the 2 of them. A mother and daughter, making their way in the world." Maria worked long hours to provide for Sophie, probably worried constantly about money and childcare and giving her daughter a good life. Yet Sophie seemed happy, well-adjusted, full of joy. Maria had somehow managed to create a loving home despite loss and hardship. Jonathan had money beyond measure, a mansion with more rooms than he could use, every material comfort imaginable. And he had created nothing but emptiness. "You're doing a remarkable job with her," he said quietly. "She's a wonderful child." Maria's expression softened with maternal pride. "She's my everything." Then she seemed to catch herself, as if remembering who she was talking to. "Not that I let it interfere with my work, of course. Mrs. Chun has never had any complaints." "Maria." Jonathan set down his mug. "I'm not evaluating your job performance. I'm trying to have a conversation. She fell silent, clearly unsure how to navigate this unprecedented situation. Jonathan couldn't blame her. He wasn't sure how to navigate it either. He had spent 3 years building walls around himself, and now he was inviting people inside those walls without any idea what came next. Cookie fall, Sophie announced sadly, looking at her collapsed tower. That's all right, sweetie. We can rebuild it, Maria said. Mr. Jonathan help? Both adults froze. It was the first time Sophie had called him by name, and the casual intimacy of it, Mr. Jonathan, as if he were an uncle or family friend, felt both presumptuous and deeply touching. It's Mr. Hartwell, Sophie, Maria corrected gently. But Jonathan was already moving his chair closer to Sophie's. Let's see what we can do. The key to a good tower is a strong foundation. For the next 10 minutes, he helped Sophie stack cookies, explaining the principles of structural engineering in terms a 2-year-old could understand, which mostly meant making sound effects when the tower fell and celebrating when it stayed standing. Sophie was an enthusiastic if imprecise engineer, and Jonathan found himself laughing, actually laughing, when she deliberately knocked over a tower just to hear the cookies crash. Maria watched them with an expression Jonathan couldn't quite read. Wonder, maybe. Or concern. Perhaps both. When Sophie yawned widely, Maria stood immediately. We should go. It's almost her nap time, and I've taken up too much of your afternoon. You haven't taken up anything. I invited you. Still, I'm sure you have work. The work will wait. Jonathan surprised himself with the words.
When had he last said that?
When had work ever waited? But if Sophie needs to rest, I understand. Maria began gathering their things, but Sophie had other ideas. She climbed down from her chair and walked directly to Jonathan, wrapping her small arms around his leg in an impromptu hug. Thank you for playing, she said, her voice muffled against his jeans. Jonathan's throat tightened. He reached down and gently touched the top of her head, those soft puffs of hair still slightly damp from the rain. Thank you for teaching me how. Sophie looked up at him with a smile that seemed to contain all the uncomplicated affection in the world. Then she released him and took her mother's hand, ready to go. At the conservatory door, Maria paused and turned back. Mr. Hartwell, I thank you for being kind to her, to us. I should be thanking you, Jonathan said. This afternoon has been. He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound ridiculous or overly dramatic. It's been good. Really good. Maria nodded, something like understanding in her eyes. Then she and Sophie were gone, leaving Jonathan alone in the conservatory with empty mugs and cookie crumbs and the lingering echo of a child's laughter. He should return to his study. The Tokyo calls, the merger documents, the quarterly projections, his entire empire waiting for his attention. Instead, Jonathan sat back down and stared out at the rain, which was beginning to lighten. The garden looked different now, not just the grounds of his estate, but the place where he had spun in circles with a laughing child. The place where something inside him had started to thaw. Helen appeared in the doorway. Will you be having dinner in your study as usual, Mr. Hartwell? No, he said, making another impulsive decision. I'll have it in the dining room tonight. Helen's eyebrows rose. He never ate in the dining room. It was too big, too empty, too full of ghosts. He and Elizabeth had hosted dinner parties there, back when they still had friends and a social life. After her death, he had abandoned the room entirely. Very good, sir. Will it just be you? Jonathan almost said yes. Then he thought about Sophie's hug, Maria's careful kindness, the way the afternoon had felt less like living through time and more like actually living. Could you ask Maria and Sophie to join me? If Maria agrees, of course. She's not obligated. But if she would like to. Helen's face transformed. She looked as if she might cry, which alarmed Jonathan considerably. I'll ask her, sir. I'm sure she'll be pleased. After Helen left, Jonathan sat with his decision. Was he overstepping? Making Maria uncomfortable by blurring the lines between employer and employee? Probably. But the alternative, returning to the isolation he had maintained for 3 years, suddenly seemed unbearable. He thought about Elizabeth. What would she think of this afternoon? Of him playing in the rain, having hot chocolate with a housekeeper and her daughter, feeling something other than grief for the first time since her death.
He thought she would be glad.
Elizabeth had hated watching him disappear into himself after she died. He had been there when it happened, had held her hand while the doctors worked frantically, had heard her whisper, "Don't stop living," before she slipped away. He had promised he wouldn't, but he had broken that promise every day since. Maybe Sophie, with her yellow raincoat and her cookie towers and her absolute conviction that he was her friend, was offering him a chance to keep that promise after all. The rain stopped entirely, and late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in golden light. Jonathan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where his life had somehow shifted on its axis. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if Maria would accept his dinner invitation, or what it would mean if she did. He didn't know if this sudden break in the clouds of his grief was temporary, or the beginning of something more lasting. But for the first time in 3 years, he wanted to find out. Maria stood in her cottage bedroom, staring at the 3 outfits laid out on her bed. Mrs. Chun had delivered Mr. Hartwell's dinner invitation with an expression that suggested Maria had somehow won the lottery and been sentenced to execution simultaneously. "He specifically asked for you and Sophie," Mrs. Chun had said, her tone carefully neutral. "You're not obligated to accept, of course." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. When a billionaire employer invited you to dinner, optional was a complicated concept. Still, Mrs. Chun had added quietly, "He seemed genuinely hopeful that you would say yes." "I've never seen him like this, Maria." Whatever happened this afternoon, it changed something. Now Maria was trying to decide between her only dress, navy blue and simple, purchased for her mother's funeral, a nice blouse with slacks, or her least worn casual clothes. What did one wear to have dinner with a man who paid your salary, in his dining room with your toddler? Sophie was on the floor, playing with her stuffed animals and chattering away, blissfully unaware of her mother's anxiety. "My friend," Sophie had been announcing to everyone since they returned from the main house. "Mr. Jonathan is my friend." Maria had tried gently explaining that Mr. Hartwell was their employer, that today had been special but unusual, that Sophie needed to understand boundaries. But how did you explain class differences and power dynamics to a 2-year-old? How did you teach caution without crushing her natural affection? And truthfully, Maria wasn't sure she wanted to. The way Mr. Hartwell had looked at Sophie, with genuine warmth and delight, wasn't something she wanted to discourage. Sophie had so few people in her life. Maria's work schedule was demanding, and they lived isolated on the estate. Sophie's playmates were limited to the occasional visit from Mrs. Chen's granddaughter and the imaginary friends she invented. If Mr. Hartwell wanted to be kind to her daughter, should Maria refuse that gift because of propriety? But the afternoon had been more than just kindness. Maria had seen something shift in Mr. Hartwell's face when he was playing with Sophie. The man who had spun in the rain, who had laughed while building cookie towers, who had hugged Sophie goodbye, that wasn't the same hollow-eyed ghost who had haunted the mansion for 18 months. Maria had heard the stories from the other staff. They all knew about Mrs. Hartwell's death, about the baby who died with her, about how Mr. Hartwell had essentially stopped living afterward. Helen, who had worked for the family the longest, sometimes spoke about how different he used to be: warm, engaged, quick to laugh. Elizabeth's death killed something in him, Helen had said once. The man we see now is just going through the motions. But this afternoon, for a brief time, Maria had glimpsed the man Jonathan Hartwell used to be. And now he wanted them to have dinner with him. She finally chose the blouse and slacks, professional but not formal, and dressed Sophie in her favorite outfit, a purple dress with flowers that she insisted on wearing at least 3 times a week. When they walked up to the main house, Sophie held Maria's hand but skipped with excitement. "We eating with Mr. Jonathan?" "We're having dinner with Mr. Hartwell," Maria corrected, though her own stomach was fluttering with nerves. "And we need to use our best manners, okay?" "Okay, Mama." Helen met them at the door and led them to the dining room. Maria had cleaned this room dozens of times but had never imagined sitting in it. The table could easily seat 20, but only 3 places had been set, clustered at one end to create intimacy in the cavernous space. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier. Fine china gleamed against the dark wood. Mr. Hartwell was already there, standing by the window. He had changed into dark slacks and a cream-colored sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. When he turned and saw them, his face lit up with a smile that transformed him entirely. "You came," he said, and there was such genuine relief in his voice that Maria's nervousness eased slightly. "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Hartwell. Please call me Jonathan. At least when it's just us." He seemed uncertain too, Maria realized. This was new territory for all of them. "Mr. Jonathan." Sophie ran to him, and he crouched down to her level automatically. "Hello, Sophie. That's a beautiful dress. It has flowers. See?" She spun to show him, and he admired the dress with appropriate seriousness. Dinner was strange and wonderful. Helen had prepared salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice. Simple, elegant food. But what should have been an awkward meal filled with uncomfortable silences became something else entirely, largely due to Sophie. She narrated everything.
"Fish.
I like fish. Mama makes fish. But not this fish. This fancy fish. Do fish swim? In the ocean? Are there sharks? I scared of sharks. But not really. Maybe a little. Mr. Jonathan, you scared of sharks?" Jonathan answered each question with genuine attention, and gradually, the conversation evolved. He asked Maria about her work, but not in a boss-evaluating employee way. He seemed genuinely curious about what her days were like, what challenges she faced, what she enjoyed. Maria found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone in months. She told him about teaching Sophie her letters, about their weekend walks to the park, about Sophie's fascination with bugs and birds. He told them about his work, but in simple terms that made it clear he was including Sophie in the conversation rather than talking over her head. "I help people build buildings," he explained to Sophie. "Big buildings where people work. Like this house. Even bigger sometimes." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really, really big?" "Really, really big," he confirmed, smiling. When Sophie began to flag halfway through dinner, getting that glazed look that meant exhaustion was winning, Jonathan immediately noticed. "Would she like to lie down? There's a sofa in the library." "I can take her back to the cottage," Maria said, beginning to stand. "Please don't go yet." The words came out quickly, almost desperately. Then Jonathan seemed to hear himself and pulled back. "I mean, if you're willing to stay a little longer, I'd appreciate it. Helen can sit with Sophie while we have coffee." Maria hesitated, then nodded. Helen appeared almost immediately. She had clearly been hovering nearby and settled Sophie on the library sofa with a blanket and stuffed animal she had somehow procured. Sophie was asleep within minutes. Jonathan led Maria to a smaller sitting room off the dining room. It was more intimate than the grand spaces of the mansion, with comfortable chairs and walls lined with books. He poured them both coffee from a carafe Helen had prepared, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. "I need to explain something," Jonathan said finally. "About today. About why He paused, searching for words. "I haven't been living. Not really. Not since my wife died." Maria set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Hart, Jonathan. You don't owe me an explanation." "I think I do. You're probably wondering why your employer suddenly invited himself to play in the rain with your daughter and then ask you to dinner. It must seem..." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It must seem bizarre." "It was unexpected," Maria admitted carefully. Jonathan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening garden. "Elizabeth, my wife. She died giving birth to our daughter. They both died. It was 3 years ago, and I've spent every day since trying not to feel anything about it. I threw myself into work. I avoided people. I turned this house into a tomb." He turned back to face her. "And then I heard Sophie laughing, and something just broke open." Maria felt tears prick her eyes. She understood grief. She understood the desperate need to protect yourself from more pain. "She reminded me what joy looks like," Jonathan continued. "What it feels like to be present in a moment instead of just enduring it. I played in the rain today, actually played for the first time in 3 years. Because of your daughter." Sophie has that effect, Maria said softly. She saved me too, after her father died. I wanted to give up, but I had her, so I had to keep going. And somewhere along the way, she taught me how to find happiness again. Jonathan returned to his chair, leaning forward intently. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Maria. I know this is unusual, an employer having dinner with his housekeeper, becoming attached to her child. If you want to maintain distance, I understand. But I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me spend time with Sophie occasionally. Not as an employer or anything inappropriate. Just as someone who needs what she seems to offer. Maria studied his face. She saw loneliness there, and grief, but also hope, fragile and new. She thought about Sophie's instant affection for him, the way she had declared him her friend. She thought about the light in his eyes when he smiled at her daughter. She thought about the risks, the power imbalance, the potential for complications, the possibility that he would tire of playing surrogate father and break Sophie's heart. But she also thought about Sophie growing up isolated, about the cottage that sometimes felt like a cage, about the fact that everyone needed connection. On one condition, Maria said finally. Jonathan straightened. Name it. You can't be her friend for a week or a month and then disappear when you get busy or when the novelty wears off. Sophie gets attached easily, and she doesn't understand when people leave. If you're going to be part of her life, you need to commit to that. Not perfectly. I understand you have obligations, but genuinely. He held her gaze, and she saw him truly considering what she was asking. That's fair. And you're right to protect her. I promise, Maria. I won't disappear on her. Maria nodded slowly. She wasn't entirely sure this was wise, but something in her gut said to trust him. Then yes, we'd be happy to spend time with you. The relief on his face was profound. Thank you. Truly. They talked for another hour, conversation flowing more easily now. Jonathan asked about Sophie's routines, what she liked to do, what she was learning. He seemed genuinely interested in the minutiae of toddler life, the books she loved, her current obsession with counting everything, her determination to do things by myself. When Helen finally appeared to tell them Sophie was stirring, Maria stood to leave. Jonathan walked them to the door, and Sophie, drowsy but awake enough to function, gave him another fierce hug. See you tomorrow? She asked hopefully. Jonathan looked at Maria, who nodded. See you tomorrow, he confirmed. Walking back to the cottage with Sophie's hand in hers, Maria felt the weight of the decision she had just made. She had essentially given this man, her employer, a billionaire, a stranger in many ways, permission to become part of their small family. It was reckless. It was risky. It violated every sensible boundary. But when Sophie looked up at her and said, "Mr. Jonathan is nice, Mama," Maria could only agree. Yes, sweetheart. He is. She just hoped he would stay that way. 3 months later, Maria stood in the kitchen garden watching Jonathan teach Sophie how to plant tomatoes. The spring afternoon was warm, the kind of day that made everything feel possible. Sophie was covered in dirt, her hands deep in the soil, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she carefully placed a seedling in the hole Jonathan had dug. Like this? She asked, looking up at him for approval. Perfect, Jonathan said, and the word carried such genuine pride that Maria felt her chest tighten. Now we cover the roots gently, like we're tucking them into bed. Together, they pushed soil around the plant. Sophie patted it down with her small hands, humming tunelessly, completely absorbed in her task. Maria still sometimes couldn't believe how much had changed since that rainy afternoon. Jonathan had kept his promise. He made time for Sophie almost every day, sometimes just 15 minutes before a meeting, sometimes entire afternoons. He taught her to identify birds, to count in threes, to paint with watercolors. He had converted an unused sunroom into a playroom with toys and books and a miniature table where they could have tea parties and work on puzzles. The mansion had transformed. Staff members actually smiled now. Jonathan had started eating meals in the dining room, sometimes joining the staff for lunch, learning their names and asking about their lives. He had begun hosting small gatherings again, business associates at first, then old friends he had pushed away after Elizabeth's death. The ghost had become a person again, and Sophie had been the catalyst for that transformation. But it was more complicated than that, Maria knew. She and Jonathan had developed their own relationship, something that existed separate from his connection with Sophie. They talked in the evenings after Sophie went to bed, conversations that ranged from philosophy to current events to their shared experiences with loss. He was brilliant and funny and surprisingly vulnerable when he let his guard down. And Maria was falling for him. It was absurd. Impossible. She was his employee, a single mother from Honduras living in his cottage, cleaning his house. He was Jonathan Hartwell, a billionaire whose world operated on a level she could barely imagine. The power differential alone made any romantic relationship inappropriate. But feelings didn't care about appropriateness. She saw the way he looked at her sometimes, with something warmer than friendship, something that made her heart race. She noticed how he found reasons to touch her hand when passing her a cup of coffee, how his eyes followed her when she moved around a room, how his smile was different when it was directed at her versus when he was playing with Sophie. Or maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was projecting her own feelings onto him, seeing what she wanted to see. "Mama, come see." Sophie's voice pulled Maria from her thoughts. "We planted 5 tomatoes. Count them." Maria walked over and crouched beside them, dutifully counting the plants. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You're becoming quite the gardener." Mr. Jonathan said, "We can pick them when they're red." "That's right," Jonathan confirmed. "But we have to be patient. It takes time for them to grow." Sophie wrinkled her nose at the word patient, and Jonathan laughed. The sound had become familiar over these months, but it still made Maria smile. He laughed easily now, especially around Sophie. "I know patience is hard," Jonathan told Sophie seriously. "But good things are worth waiting for." "Like Christmas?"
Sophie asked.
"Exactly like Christmas." "And my birthday?" "Yes." "And ice cream after dinner?" "Well, that's a shorter wait, but yes, the principle is the same." Sophie seemed satisfied with this explanation. She stood and announced, "I need to wash my hands now. They're very dirty." "Very dirty indeed," Maria agreed. "Let's go inside." But as she started to stand, Jonathan reached out and gently caught her wrist. "Maria, could you stay for a moment? Sophie can go with Helen. She's just inside." Maria's pulse quickened. "Of course." Helen materialized to take Sophie inside, leaving Maria and Jonathan alone in the garden. The sun was beginning to sink lower, casting everything in that golden late afternoon light. Jonathan still had dirt on his hands, and there was a smudge of soil on his cheek that made him look younger, less polished. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he began, then seemed to lose his nerve. He ran a hand through his hair, leaving another dirt streak. "This is harder than I thought it would be." "What is it?" Maria asked, worry creeping in. Was he about to tell her this arrangement couldn't continue? That they needed to return to employer-employee boundaries? "These past 3 months," Jonathan said, not quite meeting her eyes, "have been the best months I've had in 3 years. Sophie has brought so much light into my life, and I'm grateful beyond words that you've allowed me to be part of hers." "You've been wonderful with her," Maria said carefully. "But it's not just Sophie." Now he did meet her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "It's you too, Maria. Talking with you, getting to know you, learning to see the world through your perspective, it's been transformative. You've helped me find my way back to living again." Maria's heart was racing now. "Jonathan, I know this is complicated," he continued quickly. "I know there are power dynamics at play, and I would never want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable. If I'm misreading things, please tell me now, and we can pretend this conversation never happened." "Misreading what things?" Maria asked softly. "The way you look at me sometimes. The way you smile when I walk into a room. The fact that our conversations stretch long into the evening because neither of us wants them to end." He stepped closer. "I'm falling for you, Maria. I've probably already fallen. And I needed to tell you, even though I have no idea what comes next or how we navigate this." Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears. "I thought I was imagining it," she whispered. I thought maybe I was just projecting because she stopped herself, suddenly afraid of admitting too much. Because you what? Jonathan prompted gently. Because I fell for you too, Maria admitted. Watching you with Sophie, talking with you, seeing the person you are beneath all the armor you wore when I first started working here. But Jonathan, this is so complicated. I work for you. People will think. I don't care what people think, Jonathan said firmly. But I care what you think. I care about making sure you feel safe and respected. So here's what I propose. We take this slowly. We don't hide it, but we don't rush into anything either. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable or pressured, you tell me and we adjust. What about work? I can't quit. I need this job. Then don't quit. Or if you want to quit because dating your employer feels too complicated, I'll help you find another position that pays just as well. But Maria, I'm not trying to leverage my position to coerce you into anything. I'm just trying to be honest about how I feel. Maria studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. But all she saw was hope and fear and genuine affection. This was Jonathan at his most vulnerable, taking a risk that could explode in his face. My worry is Sophie, Maria said slowly. She's already so attached to you. If we try this, and it doesn't work out, then we make sure it works out, Jonathan said. Or if it doesn't, we handle it like adults who care about each other and about her. Maria, I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm just asking for a chance. From inside the house, they could hear Sophie singing tunelessly while Helen helped her wash up. The sound made them both smile. One date, Maria said finally. A proper date, outside this house, where we can just be two people getting to know each other without all the complications. Jonathan's face lit up with a smile that transformed him entirely.
Yes.
Absolutely. When? This Saturday? Mrs. Chun has been asking to babysit Sophie for weeks. Saturday it is. He was grinning now, boyish and delighted. Can I take your hand? Is that allowed? Maria laughed and held out her hand. He took it carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. His skin was warm, his grip gentle but steady. This is crazy, Maria murmured. Probably, Jonathan agreed. But maybe that's okay. Maybe crazy is exactly what we both need. They stood there in the garden, hands clasped, while the sun sank lower and painted everything gold. Inside, Sophie called for them, wondering where they had gone. But for just a moment longer, they stayed where they were, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real from this impossible beginning. We should go in, Maria said, but she didn't move. We should, Jonathan agreed, also not moving. Finally, laughing at themselves, they walked back toward the house together. Sophie met them at the door, clean and demanding dinner, and they fell naturally into the rhythm they had developed over these months. Jonathan lifting Sophie onto his shoulders, Maria walking beside them, all three of them together. It wasn't a traditional family. The path forward was uncertain, filled with complications they would have to navigate carefully. But as Jonathan caught Maria's eye over Sophie's head and smiled, really smiled, with all the warmth and hope that had been missing from his life for so long, Maria thought maybe they could figure it out. After all, they had already done the impossible. Jonathan had learned to live again. Maria had learned to trust again. And Sophie, with her yellow raincoat and her uncomplicated love, had reminded them both that sometimes joy came from the most unexpected places. As they sat down to dinner, the three of them at the table that had once been a symbol of Jonathan's isolation, Maria caught Jonathan's eye across the table. He reached under the table and squeezed her hand briefly, a secret gesture that sent warmth flooding through her. Sophie, oblivious to the adult complexities swirling around her, was busy narrating the tomato planting adventure to her stuffed rabbit, whom she had insisted needed to join them for dinner. And we put them in the ground, Mr. Rabbit, and we have to wait for them to grow, and then we can eat them, but not the whole plant, just the red parts, and Mr. Jonathan said. She continued on, and Jonathan and Maria listened with the same fond attention they had given her that first rainy afternoon when everything changed. Outside, The garden waited for its tomatoes to grow. Inside, three people who had all known loss and loneliness began building something new together, carefully, hopefully, one day at a time. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected. But perhaps it was the beginning they all needed.